Hello, folks. So here's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm not going to talk about Europe. I'm going to talk a little bit about the United States, and I'm going to talk a little bit about inflation, because I've been thinking about this, and something that's been bothering me for since the election, actually, is why the Democrats, in their interviews, couldn't just explain why the inflation happened, right? And actually talk about the extent to which it was their fault and what they tried to do about it. And it really hurt them, right? I mean, inflation was a big concern for Americans, rightfully so, right? Inflation is a very big problem. It erodes your life savings. It's very, very, very nasty. So I'm going to do an experiment here. I'm going to start drawing. I've opened a tool here to start some drawings so we can talk through this topic real quick. And so I'm going to draw as I chat here. Okay. So I'm going to select some boxes. We're going to start with what we're going to start with is what are the actual causes of inflation, right? What makes consumer goods more expensive, or what forces consumer goods to be more expensive? So we have four causes, and we'll go through them real quick, right? So the first cause, and the one that's most present on mind, is energy cost, right? If you have energy costs going up, let me put a little title on this thing real quick. If energy costs increase, then everything becomes more expensive to produce. Transportation gets more expensive, manufacturing gets more expensive, anything that runs in a factory, anything that uses electricity. And usually energy costs kind of rise in bulk. It's very difficult for one single energy resource like coal or oil or gas to become more expensive without all energy becoming more expensive, because they all affect each other. Right? There's very much an interconnected web. If gas is more expensive, it also puts strain on how much nuclear power or how much coal power has to be produced. If coal becomes more expensive, the same thing is true for the others. If oil becomes more expensive, transportation of all resources that end up leading to more energy production becomes more expensive. So they're all coupled together. It's impossible for one to go up without the others going up, and it's impossible for them to go up without affecting consumer goods. What's the next factor? Right, the next factor is labor. Right, so and this is a kind of a cruel one, right? But if labor becomes more expensive because there's not enough of it and there's too much pressure on the labor market, then this also has to ultimately translate in an increase of the price of everything. So unfortunately, it's really one of those effects where if everybody gets paid more, everything costs more. And unfortunately, those who are at the bottom still lose out. It doesn't do anyone any good to get paid more. It's very unfortunate. But unfortunately, it is kind of the reality. What's the third factor? The third factor is infrastructure. And really is infrastructure quality. So what this means, what I mean by this, and it factors into the other two. If infrastructure quality is bad, it's harder to transport goods, or it takes longer. People have to take detours. The roads are not direct, or the roads are damaged, and the entire system becomes less efficient. There may be traffic jams because of too many repairs or broken roads. Employees may become less reliable in terms of getting to work, for example. And this would cause employers to have to hire additional people to be redundant, right? If somebody needs to really have a business that is open, but you can't count on any given employee being able to get there in time because of that traffic, you may have to hire someone extra, and that puts more pressure on the labor market. So infrastructure quality is a very big problem over time. The last one is greed. Right, so you could get into a situation where a given sector, right, just decides to become more expensive, right? If, for example, all gas station owners decided to suddenly just double their profit margin and take home more money, then gas price would double and lots of other things would become more expensive. This is called cartel behavior, and this is why there's pretty strict regulations in the United States around cartel behavior, even if the enforcement is somewhat spotty in some areas. So those are the four factors of inflation. So as we came out of the Corona crisis, there was a certain amount of pressure on the labor market because people had to change their habits again, right? People were used to working from home or staying at home. There was a high unemployment, but now people had to actually see what jobs they were qualified and what shape the economy would take as it reopened. And actually, a lot of people had found ways to make money on the internet in ways that they could do from home. And so the amount of the workforce that was actually immediately prepared to go back to work in a physical location outside of the house was a bit lower. People had to kind of be coaxed into this. So this was a part of it. And if I say here that there was basically COVID recovery, right, putting some pressure on the labor market. This happened. It's kind of undeniable that this was happening. Wage prices were already starting to rise during the Trump administration, towards the end of the Trump administration. So this was already shaping up. All right. Infrastructure quality is a similar topic. Infrastructure quality had somewhat eroded during the Corona crisis, just because there wasn't a need to maintain it. It wasn't as immediately obvious, and there were limitations on people actually even working on infrastructure. So there was also some factor here because of the COVID crisis. It was pretty difficult to really ensure that to think that there would be absolutely no effect. Right? So we have COVID. So we have the COVID crisis impacting inflation here. Let me draw some arrows. Okay. And then finally, and this was the really big one, right, is that what really happened is this massive energy cost spike. And this was a very simple reason, right? The reason is, of course, Putin's attack, on a Russian attack on Ukraine. Right? No doubt. There's no question or doubt about this, right? This forced Europe to shift its energy supply. It forced the world to sorry, let me finish this up real quick. It forced the world to find alternatives to funding Russia's war here. And so this caused Europe to start to buy more energy from the US, but it drove up oil prices, it drove up coal prices, it drove up gas prices in Europe. Now, the US wasn't nearly as badly off here as Europe. In Europe, the price of natural gas went up by a factor of 30. All right. The amount of damage that something like that would have caused in the US is unthinkable. Fortunately, there is a little bit more social buffer and a little bit more ability for the government to compensate for these things in Europe, but for most countries. But it still caused a lot of hardship and, of course, triggered a massive amount of inflation in Europe, and some of that translated into the US. So what can you do about inflation? Right. Well, the government can tweak various variables, right? It can, of course, expand energy production, so it can do what it can to produce more energy, right? So that would be one solution, produce more energy, allow more licensing of mining for coal and oil, etc. The Biden administration definitely did this, right? Energy production, very shockingly for a Democratic administration that wants to nominally be pro-environmental, the rate at which new licenses for oil drilling were approved in the US was a record high during Biden, even more than during the Trump administration. So they definitely did what they could there, and that's definitely worth pointing out. On the infrastructure quality, this one is a double-edged sword, right? Because the infrastructure bill that Biden passed is kind of, I'm going to put this one sort of in a gray area. So this one is definitely green. I mean, Biden did what he could. I see no concerns. On the infrastructure side, I'm going to put this one in gray because they felt that infrastructure maintenance had to catch up, and infrastructure had to catch up to optimize the sort of the economy in the long term. But this may not have been the best time to do it. Because there was pressure on the labor market already from the COVID recovery, right? So the timing here may have been a bit off. Greed, what's the measure that can help and that the US kind of has is cartel laws, right? So cartel laws are there to help control greed. So, alrighty. Let's leave it like this. Okay. So what do you do about the labor market, right? This is the most controversial one, and this is the one that maybe made this question hard to answer, right? There's two things you can do, right? One is the interest rates. And unfortunately, this is a pretty harsh measure, right? Because what do you do with these interest rates? You basically put companies out of business. You put companies that are badly run out of business. You make it harder to start new companies and take out loans for new companies. And that eases the pressure on the labor market. But of course, it does it at a cost. There's no denying this, right? So when you have to take this step, it's a very significant step. And it also, puts pressure on investment prices, right? It brings down the stock market. People get pushed into margin calls, or they're just not comfortable taking on as much debt as they might have in leveraged investments. So this is a tough one. It's something you have to do. So I'm going to make it like light green because it helps with inflation. But it's also ugly. The other one, you can basically open your borders to immigration, because immigration introduces more cheap labor in order to also ease off the pressure on the labor market. So this is the controversial part, right? A populist will always be able to sort of look at what you're doing in terms of like getting your labor costs under control if you're trying to combat inflation, and they're always going to be able to use this against you if you had to do this, right? And this is something that the Biden administration massively suffered from. Now, did they have a choice? No, not really, right? I mean, they had no real choice but to build infrastructure. They had no real choice. Of course, they had to increase energy production. Increasing energy production also requires labor, so that puts more pressure on the labor market. So you have to take that labor out of some other sector, let interest rates rise, and to ease up immigration, right? Now, because these measures did work, right, and inflation did come back down to 2% towards the end of the Biden administration, and unemployment became high enough to keep some pressure on the labor market, they the new administration was very well positioned to say that they're changing policy, because they could change policy. They could stop investing as heavily in infrastructure because the infrastructure investments were basically done. They didn't need to focus on boosting energy production more because it had stabilized, and Europe was actually pretty effectively reducing its demand for natural gas and letting costs come back down. Even Europe had inflation below 2% last year. Cartel laws stay in place, and as the inflation becomes lower, you can tighten your stance on immigration again, right? So actually, ironically, right, Trump is in a position where he can kind of make good on his campaign promise now, probably without causing a massive inflation shock. And then the last one, interest rates were already going to be lowered, but the federal government doesn't take direct responsibility for interest rates. So this is a decision made by the Fed separately. So what is that up to? Again, the biggest pressure on inflation in the time when it started rising most rapidly was Putin's attack on Ukraine and the boost in energy costs. The spiral that caused, together with the COVID recovery, required loosening immigration. The Infrastructure Act was maybe a little bit questionable, but it was overdue. And interest rates had to go up because it's the only other variable. So could they have done something differently without letting inflation spiral out of control? Probably not. Could they communicate that they would do something very much differently for the 4 years going forward? Absolutely, right? So what I don't understand, and what probably is a significant failing and maybe a red flag for Kamala Harris as a presidential candidate, is that she couldn't explain this, right? The number of times that the Democratic candidates or the Democratic Party was asked about inflation without mentioning the war in Ukraine and the effect that it had on energy prices is incredibly surprising and disappointing, right? And maybe that is a signal that this is maybe not that these candidates, or the way this party is currently shaped up, isn't the ideal way to run the country. Should this have made the difference between Kamala Harris being a better candidate than Trump? To me, in my mind, probably not. Right? I still would have seen Kamala Harris as a significantly better candidate than Trump, because he also would have made no effort that I can discern to explain this, or maybe not have been able to explain this. But I can understand, right, that the way that this was handled in the debates and the interviews was far from ideal for people who like to just actually have stuff explained to them, and have someone show them that they understand how it works and that they understand and can talk about what they did, right? And I think that the political ties around talking about immigration openly in terms of its effect on inflation, and giving a rationale for this might have been damaging there, but I would probably still lean on the side of just explaining it, and being clear about it, because I don't think there's much shame in it, to be honest. It had to happen during that time period, and just like that, I'm being perfectly honest. I think that undocumented immigration is a big risk for a country. I think that a country has a right to know who's moving in, has a right to control its borders, and undocumented immigration, in the sense that it happens in the United States, is incredibly rare. In other countries, it's not really tolerated like that anywhere in Europe. So I think that conservatives definitely have a point, and I think that. And there is a big issue in the amount of immigration that the American immigration system can actually process, right? It would be much better to have an immigration system in the United States that can process the few thousand immigrants a day that it needs to be able to process, and then decide, what share of those thousands of immigrants are worth letting into the country, and have a good case for needing to get away from the country they were in, and what share of those thousands of immigrants should be sent back, right? And you have to be able to process the immigrants first, before you can make the decision of how many you let in, right? You can't. You have to have the border security that you need, and the processing that you need, the judges that you need, the facilities that you need, the personnel that you need. So the case there for a better immigration system in the U.S. is definitely valid. But in terms of inflation, like I said here, immigration pretty much had to be relaxed. Immigration policy pretty much had to be relaxed. With a better immigration system, this would have meant processing the immigrants maybe a little bit less strictly, and letting more properly vetted immigrants into the country, rather than having undocumented immigrants flood into the country, which is an unfortunate situation. So that's it. Those are my thoughts for the day. Again, I hope you found it a bit interesting, and I will stop now because I am clearly rambling and lecturing. So have a nice day.